All right, so you guys sent us some fascinating material on the moral argument for God's existence.
Right.
And I got to admit, it's gotten me thinking about some pretty big questions. And I'm really excited to kind of explore these with you all.
Yeah.
We're talking human consciousness,
Right.
biblical philosophy, even a little bit of animal behavior. So get ready for a wild ride.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think what's really compelling about the sources you sent is the way they connect
Okay.
something so personal, like our sense of right and wrong, to the bigger question of whether God exists.
Right.
You know, it's not just theoretical. It's
Yeah.
really about how we actually experience the world.
I see.
Yeah.
And, one of the things that you highlighted in the sources was this passage from Romans 2.14:15.
Right.
And it's really interesting how it suggests that even people who haven't been exposed to like specific religious laws still have this sense of morality.
Absolutely. And that passage describes this inherent sense of morality as being written on their hearts.
Oh, wow.
So some theologians interpret this to mean that humans kind of have a natural inclination towards moral behavior,
Okay.
even without explicit religious instruction.
I see.
So it suggests that it's not just learned, but perhaps something more fundamental to human nature.
That's really fascinating.
Yeah.
One thing that really stood out to me from what you pointed out in the sources is this idea about the difference between how animals and humans react to certain actions.
Yeah.
So like you're giving the example of lions. Lions don't seem to feel guilt after killing prey.
Right.
And dogs don't, wrestle with moral regret after stealing a treat.
Yeah.
But humans do.
Yeah.
Why are we so different?
It is a fascinating distinction. And, your sources tie this back to that concept from Genesis 1.27 of humans being created in God's image. So could it be that our conscience, our ability to experience guilt and remorse reflects something divine within us?
That's a really intriguing idea. And it makes me think about all the different cultures throughout history, even with vastly different customs and beliefs.
Right.
They almost universally had some concept of good and evil.
Exactly. And that universality is a key element of this argument.
Okay.
If morality were merely a social construct,
Right.
we'd expect a lot more variation in what people considered right and wrong.
I see.
But the fact that we see these core principles transcending cultural and temporal boundaries suggests that it's rooted in something deeper than just social conditioning.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So following that logic then, if murder is wrong, isn't just like an opinion, but an actual truth, where does that truth originate?
That's where the idea of a moral lawmaker comes in.
Okay.
So the source uses an analogy to legal systems.
All right.
Just as we have lawmakers for our legal codes.
Right. Moral laws must also have a source.
Right.
And the argument here is that that source is God.
Okay.
As sort of a cosmic legislator.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I know some people might push back on that, though, and say that, morality, just a social construct.
Right.
Or that it developed through evolution as a survival mechanism.
Yeah.
How do your sources address those counter-arguments?
Well, they tackle those points head on.
Okay.
So, for instance, the source argues that evolution struggles to explain things like selfless acts of goodness, altruism, or why someone would sacrifice themselves for a cause if it's all about survival of the fittest.
Right.
Those actions seem kind of counterintuitive.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
And when it comes to the social construct argument, what does the source say about that?
Well, the source points out that if morality is truly subjective, then wouldn't horrific acts, even those we find universally abhorrent,
become justifiable if enough people agree?
That's a scary thought.
It is a scary thought.
Yeah.
And, intuitively, most of us feel that some things are simply wrong, regardless of what society might dictate.
That's true.
Yeah.
Speaking of gut feelings, there was one part of your source that I found particularly impactful, and that's the section on guilt.
Right.
We've all felt it, right?
We have.
That nagging feeling we get when we mess up, big or small.
Yeah.
Where does that come from, if not from something beyond ourselves?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And the source connects this feeling of guilt to some specific biblical verses.
Okay.
One is John 16.8, where it talks about the Holy Spirit convicting the world of sin.
Right.
So could this be what we experience as guilt?
Yeah. I've definitely felt that before.
Yeah.
That sense that I've done something wrong,
Right.
even if no one else knows about it.
Yeah.
And then, what was that other verse? The one about King David?
Yes, Psalm 51.3 to 4,
Right.
where King David expresses his guilt directly to God, not just to those he's wronged.
So it's not just feeling bad because we broke some human rule, but because we violated something bigger,
right?
Something at the core of our being, and maybe even something that connects us to the divine.
Exactly. And, you know, if we kind of zoom out and look at the bigger picture of this moral argument,
right?
It's not simply about proving God's existence.
Okay.
It's about recognizing our need for something beyond ourselves, something that can offer forgiveness and redemption for the things we've done wrong.
Right. So that need for something beyond ourselves, that search for redemption, it seems like that's where the source starts to connect the moral argument to faith.
Precisely. That's where the conversation shifts from philosophical exploration to spiritual implications, and where we start to see the connection to the concept of salvation through Jesus, which is a key theme in this material.
This is all so fascinating.
It is.
They've covered a lot of ground already.
Yeah.
From animal behavior to biblical philosophy to the very personal experience of guilt.
Right.
It feels like this deep dive is taking us on a journey from logic and reason to something much more profound.
Yeah.
Something that touches on the very essence of what it means to be human.
I agree. It's an exploration of not only the intellectual arguments for God's existence, but also the internal echoes of that existence within ourselves.
Yeah.
And it seems like the source is leading us toward a question.
Okay.
If this sense of right and wrong, this guilt that we feel, is evidence of something bigger, of a divine moral law, how do we respond to that?
That's a really powerful question.
It is.
Yeah.
And what does this mean for our lives?
Right.
For our choices, for our understanding of the world?
I'm eager to delve deeper into that.
Yeah.
But before we do, let's take a moment to reflect on what we've discussed so far. We've explored the foundation of the moral argument.
Right.
This idea that our innate sense of right and wrong points to something beyond ourselves, possibly even to a divine creator. We've considered counter-arguments.
Yeah.
Like the idea that morality is merely a social construct or a product of evolution.
Yeah.
But even those arguments seem to lead us back to the same fundamental questions.
Exactly.
What is the source of our morality?
Right.
What does it mean for us as individuals and as a society?
Yeah.
And ultimately, how does it shape our understanding of our place in the universe?
Big question.
These are big questions.
Yeah.
And we'll continue to explore them in just a moment.
All right. Sounds good.
Yeah. It's easy to get caught up in the intellectual arguments about God's existence, but this has really emphasized the personal aspect for me. Like, we're not just debating abstract concepts here. We're talking about something that touches on our deepest feelings and experiences.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, the moral argument isn't just about logic and reasoning. You know, it's about recognizing something within ourselves, something that kind of resonates with this idea of a universal moral code.
Like that feeling of guilt we were talking about before.
Right.
It's not just an idea. It's something that we feel so deeply, and it can be really powerful.
Exactly.
And if this source is right, that feeling might actually be a clue.
Yeah.
A piece of evidence pointing to something bigger at play.
Right. It's like our conscience acts as this internal compass kind of guiding us towards a sense of right and wrong that goes beyond just the material world.
Okay.
And your source is saying that something bigger is God.
Now, you also included some stuff about how this moral argument ties into the Christian idea of salvation. What did you find compelling about that connection?
Well, it goes back to that concept of guilt we've been discussing.
Right.
You know, if our conscience is a reflection of God's moral law, then the guilt we experience might be a sign that we haven't lived up to that law.
So how does the source material try to address this problem of human failing? Does it offer any solutions?
Well, that's where the concept of Jesus comes into play.
Okay.
So the source explains that in Christian theology, Jesus fulfilled the law and offers us grace and redemption.
So it's not just about acknowledging a higher moral law, but also recognizing our need for forgiveness.
Yeah.
And finding a way to bridge that gap between our actions and that ideal standard.
Exactly. It's about seeking a relationship with God through Jesus, accepting his sacrifice as a way to reconcile ourselves with that divine moral law that we may have fallen short of.
It's almost like the moral argument is creating this pathway, leading us from this innate sense of right and wrong to the recognition that we need something more, and ultimately to the possibility of finding that something more in a relationship with God.
That's a really insightful way to put it, and the source really highlights that this isn't just an intellectual exercise.
Yeah.
It's a journey of personal and spiritual understanding.
But let's be honest, not everyone is going to buy into this.
So,
I mean, we've touched on some counter-arguments.
Right.
But I'm sure there are plenty of people out there who would say morality is simply what society decides,
right.
or that it's all about survival and nothing more.
Uh-huh.
How does the source respond to those objections?
Well, it kind of circles back to that concept of objective morality.
Okay.
If there's no ultimate standard of right and wrong, then how can we condemn acts like genocide or slavery?
Right.
If morality is relative, those actions could be justifiable if enough people agree.
Yeah.
Which just feels deeply unsettling to most of us.
Yeah, it does.
And then regarding the evolutionary argument, the source emphasizes that it doesn't fully account for those acts of altruism or self-sacrifice,
Right.
which seem to contradict that whole idea of survival of the fittest.
So we've kind of gone through the argument and some counterpoints.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about all this? Does any of this resonate with your own experiences?
I think it's important to acknowledge that these are really complex questions with no easy answers. What I find compelling about the moral argument is that it encourages us to look inward,
Okay.
to examine our own sense of right and wrong and consider its origins.
Mm-hmm.
It suggests that our moral compass might be pointing us towards something beyond ourselves, something that gives meaning and purpose to our lives.
I agree. It's an invitation to kind of explore the deeper implications of our moral intuitions.
Right.
Whether we ultimately arrive at a belief in God or not.
Precisely. The moral argument doesn't force a conclusion,
Right.
but it opens up this whole realm of fascinating questions about human nature, our place in the universe, and the possibility of a higher moral order.
And that's what makes this deep dive so intriguing.
Yeah.
We're not just discussing these philosophical theories. We're exploring questions that have resonated with humanity for centuries.
Mm-hmm.
Questions about good and evil, right and wrong, and the nature of our own existence.
Big stuff.
It's a journey of discovery, both intellectual and personal.
Wow.
It's amazing how we started with animal behavior and Bible verses, and now we're talking about the meaning of life.
Right.
And this whole idea of a higher moral order.
Yeah, it really shows how everything's connected, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
When you start exploring one idea, it can take you to some pretty unexpected places.
Yeah, sure.
And open up all these new ways of thinking.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
We've explored the core of this moral argument. This idea that our gut feeling about right and wrong points to something bigger than ourselves.
Yeah.
Maybe even a divine creator.
Right.
We've looked at different ways to understand those Bible passages and thought about counter arguments, like the idea that morality is just something society makes up or that it's all about survival.
Right.
But even those arguments seem to bring us back to the same basic questions.
Yeah, they do.
Like, where does our morality come from? What does it mean to live a good life?
Right.
And is there something more to our existence than just what we see and touch?
Absolutely.
What stands out to you from all of this?
What really resonates with me is the challenge this whole moral argument presents.
Okay.
It's asking us to look at our own lives, our choices, and the principles that guide our actions.
Yeah.
And it's not just for religious people either.
Right.
These questions are relevant to all of us.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I agree with that. It's not about proving or disproving whether God exists. It's about figuring out what it means to be human.
Yeah.
Recognizing that we have this sense of morality inside us.
Right.
And exploring what that might mean for how we live our lives.
Yeah.
How we treat each other.
Right.
And how we find meaning and purpose.
I think that's a really important point.
You mentioned before that the source material connects the moral argument to the Christian idea of salvation.
Yeah.
Did that resonate with you?
Yeah, I found that connection pretty compelling. It's like the moral argument creates this bridge between our gut feeling about right and wrong and the possibility of finding redemption and reconciliation through faith. But even for people who aren't coming from a religious perspective,
Right.
I think there's still a lot to think about here.
Yeah, definitely.
It encourages us to reflect on those big questions. Like what does it mean to live a good life? What principles should guide how we act?
Yeah.
And is there something more to life than just the physical world?
It really pushes us to think about a moral order
Right.
that goes beyond our personal preferences or what society tells us is okay.
Exactly. And to try to live our lives in a way that aligns with that higher purpose.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what should our listeners take away from all of this?
I think the most important thing is to stay curious.
Okay.
Keep asking those questions.
Yeah.
Explore different points of view and really examine your own beliefs and values.
Yeah, I like that.
This deep dive has hopefully given you a framework for thinking about morality and what it all means.
Right.
But this is really just the beginning. The stuff we talked about today is really just scratching the surface. Your sources also mention natural law.
Right.
Have you thought about diving into that more?
That's a great point.
It might give you even more insights into where our moral intuitions come from.
Yeah, we've really only just dipped our toes into this huge ocean of ideas.
Exactly.
And there's so much more out there to discover.
Yeah.
So I hope this deep dive has inspired you to keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep searching for a deeper understanding of yourself and the world around you.
You know, the real understanding doesn't come from just accepting easy answers.
Right.
It comes from really thinking things through and being open to different perspectives.
Well said.
Yeah.
Well, until our next deep dive, keep those questions coming.
Yeah.
And never stop searching for truth and meaning.
Right.
And a deeper understanding of what it means to be human.